Hey, hello, can you hear me? Is it all? Yeah, okay. So my name is Paul Humtigan. As he said, I'm the Chief Product Officer of Flowable. I'm also the lucky person who's got this mid-afternoon slot when everyone just really wants to have a slide kip. So before I get going, it'd be useful for me to understand a bit about you people. So I mean, how many people here are actually product managers of some way, shape or form? That's pretty much everyone. Okay, good. And how many of you is that for SaaS products? Okay, yeah. How many people do product management for on-premises product? Okay, we've got some people. So it's not just going to fall on deaf ears. Good. So, I mean, hopefully for those of you in the SaaS world, when I'm talking about our stuff which is on-premises, it may not be directly relevant to you, but there may be a few well, okay, that's vaguely interesting sort of comments come up there. But let me get going. No. Right, so Flowable, what is it? That's the burning question on all of your minds. We position ourselves in the market as intelligent automation. This is a label that a bunch of people are using now in the case and business process management space. So it's usually a combination of automation and words like intelligent or digital or transformation or something like that. And it's enterprise software. So first of all, anyone here actually used BPM software? Does anyone? Okay, a few, that's good. Okay, so the rest of you, any of you have got bank accounts? Any of you applied online for a bank account or an insurance or a loan or made a claim? Or yeah, you know, so all of you are participants in business process management. You just don't know about it. And it's enterprise software. What that means is we don't sell it to the people that are going to use it. We sell it to people that are going to take it and then configure it for the people that are going to use it. And it also means that it's usually very large companies and very deep pockets and have very high expectations. The particular term we use for our stuff is deep low code. I'm not going to go into what that is, but that's the sort of label that we use for that. And the business we've got is based around open source. So we make our money off an open source product. And it's not just open source where we give the source away, it's also based around open standards, which is another important aspect to all of this. So it's all about open standards. You can use something that is other people can use and reference, but it's also implemented in code that you can take and play with. Because it's enterprise and because the type of use case we have, it's all about high performance and scale. And again, there's all sorts of discussions about what that means to different people. But in our space, you know, we're high performance, high scale, and we've got some very significant customers using us in very significant ways. So who are those customers? Shooting ahead there. Who are those customers? Again, this is just to establish some credibility. I don't want to stand up here and say that we don't really do anything interesting. So that's interesting formatting of a presentation going on there for me. So Dow Jones, a lot of our customers you'll find in enterprise, they don't like you telling people that they use you or whatever. So Dow Jones is one of the few that talks publicly about us. Dow Jones, all the articles that Dow Jones have, they come into a system they call Factiva. That's all managed by our technology, Flowable. So basically, Flowable is ingesting and the process of actually getting sort of materials into Dow Jones, whether it's sort of paper-based, whether electronic, but however it comes in, how it's classified, what intelligent systems they use for doing the classification, reorganization, routing, and everything else. That's managed by Flowable. Company I can't name. A new digital streaming service that's come online recently, globally. Give yourself a plus if you work out who that is. They obviously getting stuff to the digital storefront, you've got to get everything in place. And if it's global, that means it's multilingual, you've got multicultural, so which images you actually use can depend on where you're actually, which region you're pushing your latest movie, your latest TV show to. So all of that is orchestrated, and it's a mix of humans and machine sort of elements that are brought into place here. So they're using Flowable to actually orchestrate all of that information. Another well-known brand is using in internet security, is using us in their cloud product. And this is they're actually embedding some of our UI into their own product to allow their customers to configure how they respond to a security incident. You know, if you're an enterprise and you get an infection, then what do we do to actually neutralize it? So they're using Flowable's the business process management, what steps, what processes, what systems need to be involved, what people need to be involved, how do we make sure that we follow due process and everything like that. So they're using it. Big customers for us in finance. And that also has a big play in terms of the type of things we do. Interestingly, in enterprise software, one of the hardest things as product manager is to actually get in contact, well, the contact between the product manager and the end customer, because what often happens with enterprise is someone in the enterprise, typically IT department or someone else, or a system integrator will take your product and configure it for the enterprise. So you're never actually building product for the end user. You're building product for a middle person who's going to build product for the end user. The exception we've got is there's one particular product we have which is very hot in finance at the moment, a conversational banking. So you've got a multimillionaire in Hong Kong, and he's got a sort of his portfolio managed by some global bank. In the old days, they talk by phone and have this personal relationship with a relationship manager with inside the bank. Now they're doing that over chat. If you're in Asia, they're using WeChat. If you're in Europe, it's probably WhatsApp, or in the US, the same WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger. And how do you actually do that, manage all of that, make sure that as you're having these conversations, due processes is happening, you're not introducing people into a conversation that are seeing things they shouldn't see and stuff like that. All of that is managed by the Flowable technology. So hopefully that's established some what we're about. Oh, yes, right. So the open source bit. So again, how many people are familiar with, as in properly familiar with open source? I mean, a lot of people are using it, but okay. Yeah, so this is, I mean, it's still quite shocking the number of people who are using open source, but actually don't really understand a lot of what's behind it. So Flowable is Apache licensed. Now, for those of you who know, that means that it's liberal. Basically, anyone can take it and do pretty much anything they want with it. So they could take Flowable and they could rebrand it as their own and sell it, and we can do nothing about it. So yeah, literally, it's for free. You can do what you want with it. We have active public forums where we'll get involved as well. People asking questions. How do I do this? I've got a problem. How do I fix this? Again, totally free. We get contributions from the community as well, which they contribute freely sometimes. And all of this is for free. The one thing we do, which not every open source project does, but most of the commercial ones do, is any code that comes into our project is actually our staff that put that into the code base. But all of that, you can be using Flowable and you don't need to pay a penny. Now, those previous companies I talked about are paying us a penny, so there's obviously a reason behind that. And that's really, the dance you have to do as a product manager is how to make money out of this and how do you get your product to sort of spreading around the world, people are aware of it, and everything else. And there's a history to commercial open source. So this is the world, professional commercial open source. How do you make money when you're giving stuff away for free? And it's evolved over time. So when I'm an old lag. I've been doing software they did have software when I was born. It was just feeding it into machines in paper. But when I started open source, commercial open source about 15 plus years ago, the way you made money was actually by selling documentation and support. That was how you made money. And there's been a sort of cycle of how people have progressed, sort of changing the way you do the open sourcing. One of the things we also did in early days was having attribution license. So if you used our software in your own product, you actually had to put a flag up and say, or a logo that you were actually using our product. So even the end customer would see your logo somewhere along the stream. Or you put really juicy features were not in open source. Everything that was really juicy was outside the open source. The problem with all of these was you think it's going to get you more money, but it actually becomes very difficult. And you find it introduces other barriers for you, both from an organization selling, but also in terms of thinking about your product and thinking about the important, valuable parts of your product. What's happened over time, other things that people have do is having open source licenses like LGPL. I bet there's a bunch of you out there that are using LGPL software thinking that's fine, it's open source, I can do what I want with it. But it's legally untested, untried. The previous talk talking about your exit strategy. If your exit strategy is to get bought by a big company or to make a big OEM or something like that, if you go to one of these companies, their lawyers will say, LGPL just, it's not going to cross the threshold. That's it, you know. So actually choice of the license is important. So you can make a choice, I'll make my software at LGPL, because if it gets to play in the, you know, in a serious way, then someone is going to have to pay serious money for it, because they're not going to just take it for free and use it. All of these have been barriers, and the way people are doing a sort of commercial open source now is what's called open core. So there's quite a few well-known ones here, and sort of valued significantly as well. And what that is you have a core set of capabilities which are very liberally licensed. Like I said, Apache for us just means you can do what you want with it. So there's a core which anyone can do what they want with, but then you have a significant component that is commercial only. Now, in the old days, you'd be going 95% open source, and then maybe a 5%, which is, you know, the closed proprietary, the extra special source that people want to pay for. With open core, it's you know, reduced that. It's not flipped it. It is still, you know, you're talking about a lot of the value is still in the open core, but you're talking about, you know, 30, 40% of functionality that is in the commercial piece. Now, when you're in product management, and like I say, so for those of you that in the SaaS world, a lot of this may not apply. Some of it could apply if you think about freemium models and things like this, but you know, for an on-premises enterprise product, then you know, it is quite different. And you know, when I talk about on-premises, that doesn't necessarily mean literally on-premise. Most of our customers are actually deploying in Amazon, in Azure, in Cloud Foundry, but it's effectively their own servers. It's just on someone else's hardware, as it were. But you're competing really against two very different classes of product. One is other open source vendors. Typically, I mean, open source is quite a mature space now, so anything that you come up with, there's a good chance that there's someone else already doing open source in that space. Could be commercially, or if you're unlucky, it may be someone like you know, a Facebook or Google or someone like that, who is, I mean, they're basically funding open source by the, you know, Facebook and Google tax that we're all paying. But you're often competing against other open source projects. And that's very different from competing against the proprietary vendors. Typically in the enterprise space, that is your Microsofts, it is your Oracles, it is your IBMs, it's your OpenText and everything. There's, you know, people with very big sales and marketing pockets and very big product and developer communities. And those are very different communities that you're targeting. And so you actually have to think about both of those quite distinctly when you're actually building your product. And that means that the audiences are quite different. So in the open source world, you are targeting developers. I mean, that's the open, as a commercial open source approach, that's really the business model. I'm going open source, so I'm going to try and do bottom-up marketing. I'm not going to do spending marketing dollars trying to push something down someone's throat. I'm actually going to do it by stealth or whatever. I'm going to sort of get the developers picking this up, and developers aren't bottom feeders, but that sort of bottom up, you know, someone building something and it bubbling up to something useful and eventually something that becomes mission critical. That is the open source sort of business model. Get it out there, get it propagated, get people using it, and then at some point somebody may decide to give you some money. That is a very slow way of making revenue, and it also is not the best way to make significant revenue. So you are also targeting businesses, and there you are targeting specifically in the enterprise world, the CTO and the CIO. So you're looking when you're doing your product releases and what goes into a product at two very different communities with very different needs and very different expectations. In the open source world now, it used to be that you'd worry about you know, other open source vendors or somebody just taking your software and using it free. Now people worry about, you know, is Amazon just going to take my software if I'm successful and stick it in AWS and sell it as part of their services? Again, I'll talk about this very briefly later. All of these things in your mind, they can be problems and they can be things that you get very defensive about. One of the nicest things about open source, if you sort of embrace it fully, is it gives you a way to think about things in a far more positive way, and it allows you to exploit and leverage those things rather defensively. You can use them as a way of attack in the marketplace. The other real problem with open source is your sales force. Particularly in enterprise, you've got very expensive salespeople, very high expectations of how they're spoon-fed stuff to make lots of money. And the first thing that you will get for these sales guys, if they're not coming from open source, is you've got to be crazy to be giving this software away. We're actually competing against ourselves. The typical conversion rate for enterprise open source is about 1%. And so the sales guys say, well, if we could just make that 2%, that's doubling our revenue. It's just brutally hard to actually change that conversion rate in reality. But the sales guys, unless they've been living and breathing this, they don't understand this. And this may be, again, if you're, you could have the same similar type of thing with freemium type of models as well. It's always the thing, we're giving too much away. The other one that you hear is also we're letting the competition find out about our weaknesses. So, you know, that gives insight into what you're doing. Then, you know, so no longer can we tell the customer we're fantastic, because our competitors can tell our customer before we've sold it to them that there's some flaws that, you know, they need to think about. Now, all of those are very defensive, and they are things that you have to combat in this sort of freemium open source world. But really the thing to think about in this, and this is a good way of thinking about product and a good way of thinking about what you're doing, is it's not competitive just today. It's not just closing off something that's happening today. It's basically you've got to make that so that's all the time. You can't be defensive forever. Somehow you've got to change and make what you're doing a very positive story. And openness, if you're an open source, that inculcates the way you work into being open. But actually, as a general business practice, the more open you can be, you'll find that is a cultural advantage. It means that you're saying, I'm not defensive, I'm not hiding anything, you can see stuff. So actually, I'm so confident about what we're doing, I'm so confident about my product, I'm so confident about my team, that I know we're going to continue innovating. So if you jump in with us, we're going to take you forward in an innovative way. We're not just going to be working in a defensive, you know, circle the wagons mentality. One of the other real advantages when you do something where you make it widely available free is you get a very large community of skilled people that know about your product. So again, a lot of the challenges, particularly in enterprises, where you've got a solution, and to close the gap between the overall, you know, generic solution and a particular customer solution, you need people to customize and tweak and you know, fill the gaps for you. If you're closed proprietary, then those tend to be very expensive and rare resources. If you're open source, if you've made it very free and possible for people to learn and play your software, then you can actually get this wider community and get people being able to use and adapt your software very quickly. Now, as I was saying, you're product managing for different people, and this is where there is some real tension between these two different audiences. With developers, it is bottom up, and developers like playing with the latest stuff. So you've got to be doing things that seem to play along with the latest stuff. On the other side of the fence, I can't believe the number of times we still hit against customers that are using IE6. I mean, you know, anyway. But yeah, playing with the latest technologies. One of the things that has changed, and so people that have been around for a while in this space, developers now are not nearly as willing to dive in and spend time learning stuff as they used to be. They expect to be fed stuff. So even for developers now, we've got to do things to give them easy examples to get up and play with. So that is actually a big cultural change that we've seen, particularly in the last 5 years. One of the really hard things in this community is, I mean, there's all this thing about, you know, how do you actually measure stuff? How do you get feedback? How do you know you're doing the right thing? With open source, we don't know who's doing what with our software. We don't even know who's downloaded our software, because you can get our software from various places where it's not actually tracked. We can't track who's downloading it. They're downloading it from a Maven repository or something like this. You have no idea who's using your software. And trying to get feedback, trying to get an understanding of, are we actually making any progress compared to what? One of the things that you'll see is the offshore locations. So we had, I mean, Flowable as a separate brand has been going for about 3 years. We had about 18 months ago a sudden kickoff of people on the forums from India. Okay, and then just early this year, we had a huge kickoff. Literally thousands of people from China suddenly joined the forums and started asking questions. And that's an indicator that basically these offshore people are actually saying to these offshore teams, you need to use this particular open source software or whatever. So that there are some ways that you can get some idea of what's going on. But generally, again, product management, you've got very few ways of getting data about how people are actually using your software and getting feedback there. And the idea with the developer type of communities is you're trying to neutralize the other open source competition here. So you're not necessarily trying to compete against them in terms of beating them in a particular market space. You're trying to, with the open source competition, you're trying to neutralize them as much as possible. One of the really nice things about having either freemium and open source things is you can suddenly switch on something from being commercial to being free. You can make it available as a feature without having to do anything apart from maybe turning a switch. That can be really useful, again, to do that, to respond to the market or something, or to an open source competitor, to differentiate yourself in some way. Again, one of the other pieces that you want to try and do with developers, and one of the things that I've noticed very much working with open source, is the product managers tend to act like an insulation layer between the developers and the people that are actually using the software. One of the really nice things we found with open source is you can actually close that gap. Some of the people that are on the forums are end users and they're talking to the developers. And you can actually get bottom up from the developers some really interesting and significant product features. And it's, again, it's thinking about, is there ways, even when I'm a product manager, even in consumer, even in SaaS, are there ways that I can actually get my developers more engaged, more understanding about how our customers are using it in order to actually let them make suggestions? You know, product managers aren't the best people always for saying what should be in product. On the other side of things, when we're targeting the business, CIOs, CTOs, I mean, I'm still really very fond of old school of Geoffrey Moore, Crossing the Chasm, targeting something. Once you're hitting that sweet spot and you actually hit that market, then going into adjacent areas and growing out from that. So do all the traditional stuff you do there. One of the nice things with the free open source wing is, one of the challenges is people say, well, now I've got the open source, I can do everything for free. You know, I've got my developers, I'm already paying them that sunk cost, so basically I can make my product, you know, I don't need to pay you anything, I can do everything for free. What you do then in the product management, you're looking for things that, how do you get people to pay to get there quicker? The drive to get sort of to market, to get value from the return on investment or whatever, that's what you're trying to fill the gap for. So how do you get them to get their solution completed faster? How to do it more securely. In enterprise, security is critical. You know, who can see what, who can do what. Those sorts of things, to get that right is really hard. You can say, yes, your developers can do that, but if you've done it for a bunch of other companies and a bunch of banks and a bunch of, you've got some credibility to say, well, this has been tried and tested by these sorts of organizations. There's real value for you to just take this and run with it. The other thing that's become more relevant for everyone, it used to be just in the financial space primarily, was auditability. Now with things like GDPR, there are things where actually this software is auditable. If you use this, you know exactly what's been going on. You can show an audit trail of who did what, when, whereby, where they came from and everything like that. And in the financial space, you can even go a step further. For our chat-based conversational banking, we actually had to get that signed off by regulators in Hong Kong, for example. Now, if someone wanted to do that as a business themselves, the open source, each of them would have to go to the regulator and get their solution So it's finding these things that make it hard for the end customer to actually just sort of build it themselves. And that gives you a way of thinking about what is the real value to what we're doing. How do, you know, just having the cogs turning at the core, actually anyone can do that adequately, but really it's how do I make those cogs work really smoothly? How do I add additional cogs that allow the business to run more effectively and get going quicker? So yeah, the value of free is, there is real value to this bottom-up marketing, getting it out there, getting people using it, getting yourself sticky because people are using it somewhere. At some point that will become of value. One of the nice things with open source, which isn't true in the SaaS world, it's hard to do in the SaaS world, but it's worth thinking about other ways of doing it, is you can experiment, and if something is a failed experiment, you can still leave it out there. People can still use it. You're not taking it away from them. I think that's one of the really bad things what you can do with something like a freemium model or something is take a feature away, and suddenly it's gone away. And you may not understand why you're losing customers. You may not realize that it's that feature you've taken away. The other thing you can do is actually switch on features very easily. So you've gone from something that's commercial and you're making it available free. So you can respond very quickly. And the way we tend to work is we have almost like a rolling wave. We're constantly building out the commercial special stuff, but that means over time we can also roll off some of the commercial stuff into open source. So we just can keep people interested, to keep the open source community moving with us as well. One of the other challenges that it's very easy to do, again, from the product management point of view of thinking about value, is just because it's free that you say, well, it's not worth anything, so I'm actually not going to improve it. You have to really think hard about why did you make something free? What is the value to the customer of that being free? And continue to make it there free, because that is maybe one of the catches that allows you to hook someone, maybe not today, but hook them and they'll come on board later. And the real challenge with all of lots of challenges with open source, making money out of it, but is actually to remain relaxed about it. There's a lot you can do from the commercial, traditional pitching to the CIO, CTO, but the real stickiness, the real value takes time to come through. So you have to chill. That 1%, you're not going to change it. Just live with it and accept it. Focus on what you can focus on. And at one point, in the future, someone may actually turn around and say, this is something that we want to pay for. And it's funny, I've seen this a number of times where the sales cycle for some of our things can seem like literally sort of an hour, where somebody says, what's the price list? What's the price for this, for your product? You say this, and then you literally had an order come in for it, and you think, well, how? That's amazing. What you don't know is actually they took a version 2 years ago. They were playing with it. Some developer took it, and it's suddenly got more and more used, more and more important, and suddenly it's going into a data center, and data center has a policy that, and if there's support for an open source thing, you've got to get support for it, otherwise it's not coming in. So yeah, it could have been a 2-year actual sales cycle because it was the developer that started it, but from you as part of the business, you just see this. But yeah, so there's all sorts of these different dimensions that when you're building the product, you need to think about. But it's always thinking about, just because it's free, just because it's open, doesn't mean it's valueless. The value of open source, the value of free, is actually thinking hard about what the value is to the end person or the end group that you're marketing or selling to there. So that's where I was going to stop, and I think I can take questions if people have any questions, and maybe I'm even ahead of time, which is a bonus for you guys, because then get a chance to... Oh, right. Is OSS being community-driven a real thing or a nice dream? Okay, it's a dream. Well, it depends. So it depends on the open source community, but typically I would say it's a dream. The reality is almost probably 99% of the code that gets written is written by your people in commercial open source. There's a really very small percentage that's written by the community. In terms of lines of code, there's absolute value from people trying your stuff out on weird and wacky new platforms. So you'll get exposed to the latest technologies, the latest platforms similar than everyone else, because some weirdo has taken your thing and just decided to put it on something that they thought was a cool thing. So you do get feedback, you do get bug fixes coming in, but not significant features. Yeah, 10 key contributors, and typically they're your own people for us. Yeah. What can freemium SaaS businesses learn from this? I think this is the real problem with SaaS and freemium is with open source, the artifact is still there and is still accessible to people, so they can take it and they can run with it, do something with themselves. I think it would be really interesting in the SaaS world, in freemium, to think about, are there ways, and this is also, when you architect for open source, particularly enterprise open source, you put lots of places where you can extend the product, because everyone needs to customize and change it and extend it. So think about where you can do extension points. It is a good thing to put into your product. And I think if there's ways of thinking about how a SaaS product can have extension points that mean that if you take away a freemium feature, it's still possible for someone else to plug in and continue or do something themselves, I think that's the only way you can really do it. Yeah, it's a tricky one. But yeah, thinking about the value of free, why is it free? Why did you make it free? Why are people using it? Yeah, there's still the same thing about thinking hard about it. It's not just free is free and it's worth nothing. How do you manage the integration of community product enhancements to your commercial offering? So the beautiful thing with Git, and those of you not aware of Git, hopefully most people are aware of Git and GitHub, things like this, it's you've got pull requests. So what we can do is people can actually make a fork of the code, they can make changes, and they can submit to you a pull request. But it's actually you that accepts that pull request and pull that code into your code base. And it just gives you a way to allow people to build, test, run everything else, and give you a finished change set, and you can just take that change set in. Typically, with some modifications. With enterprise open source software, there's not many people out there really that understand how to do things in a highly scalable, highly performant way. So there's usually changes that you need to make, and that's why you have your guys doing that sort of final bringing stuff in. But yeah, it's the technology around source code management is really what enables effective contribution from people completely outside. For growing an engaged developer community, it's really hard, because what happens is often the vociferous ones, they're noisy and they're needy and they're not actually that bright, or no, they're not. They're not bright in terms of understanding maybe your technology. No, that is one of the very difficult things. I think the way you can do it is thinking about the technologies that are interesting to developers, what's coming along. In our space now, it's all around microservice architectures that are driven not by sort of REST type of things, but event-driven microservice architectures. So actually doing things that facilitates some of the architectures and the new approaches to those architectures. It's doing those things, making those simple examples that people can do, even if the industry you're working in doesn't actually want that yet. That's the sort of thing that gets your developer community engaged. So, thank you very much for your time and patience, and yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Suresh Kudamandi, founder and CTO of